Good afternoon, everybody, and just a warm welcome to our talk this afternoon. We are thrilled and honoured to have Professor Pil Ho Kim come and talk to us about his exciting new book on Gangnam and culture industry, capitalism, development and concrete in Korea, Polarizing Dreams. And we're just really grateful for Professor Kim to come and join us and share his insights and his research. Also thrilled to introduce Professor Jae-won Chung from Rutgers University, who will be moderating the Q&A for us. My name is Ruth Barraclough, and I work here at the Centre for Korea Research together with my colleague, Professor Jung-won Kim. And just a warm welcome to you all. We're looking forward to the talk and to a vibrant Q&A as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introductory remarks, Professor Barclough. Welcome, everybody. I am Jae-won Chung from Rutgers University. It's really my pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Pil Ho Kim and his work today. I met Professor Kim for the first time at a manuscript workshop at the University of Michigan over 5 years ago. It feels like a million years ago. But since then, I feel in many ways that we were fated to meet because we collaborated in so many different ways since then. And along the way, I also had the pleasure of seeing his manuscript grow. And finally, it's out in the world. And it's just wonderful that he's able to come here and share his work with us at Columbia. So I will give a formal introduction, but I also wanted to say a few personal remarks about how much his work has meant to me as a younger scholar. Here's the formal introduction. He is an associate professor of Korean in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at The Ohio State University. Dr. Kim specializes in Korean society and culture. A sociologist by training, he has been studying and teaching a wide range of topics related to modern Korea, including popular music, cinema, literature, urban culture, and social polarization. He has published research articles in Positions, Korean Studies, a Journal of Japanese and Asian Cinema, the Asia Pacific Journal, Korea Observer, and Acta Koreana, among others. He is the author of Polarizing Dreams, Gangnam and Popular Culture in Globalizing Korea, University of Hawaii Press, which takes an unflinching look at Gangnam, the epicenter of Hallyu. The Gangnam portrayed in the book is the site of rampant disaster capitalism and rising inequality, as well as the engine of cultural and technological innovation. His next book project will investigate the trans-Pacific cultural impact of Black freedom movements on modern Korean history, abolition literature in colonial Korea, civil rights songs circulated among South Korean democracy activists, K-pop fandom support for Black Lives Matter, and other notable cases over the course of more than a century. He's also co-editor of Ditta, a Korean Humanities in Translation at Rutgers University Press, which will be releasing its first 3 titles this year. So as I mentioned earlier, I have had several instances of working with and collaborating with Professor Kim. The Big Ten Academic Alliance across Rutgers, Ohio, and many other university campuses have this program called the eSchool, Korean Studies eSchool program, where we kind of share courses and we co-teach or receive and host courses. So I've had a chance to hear from my students who have taken classes with Professor Kim at the undergraduate as well as at the graduate level, and they've spoken glowingly about his work as an instructor, as a professor and a pedagogue and a mentor. I've also worked with him in the Korean Literature Association Executive Committee, and he hosted and ran a wonderful conference last year at The Ohio State University on performativity, and I know that he's training a new generation of scholars in different ways, directly and indirectly. And finally, I had a chance to kind of see his wisdom and sort of his sort of cultural capital in the Korean South Korean cultural field through our conversations in Ditta, and just amazing how many folks, how many scholars and writers and artists he's in touch with and he's able to kind of draw from. So I always say I teach Korean literature, cinema, but I also kind of teach courses on pop culture and on other kinds of courses that kind of draw in the students in different ways. And in many ways, I have to do my homework too, right? I have to like look up stuff. Sometimes songs are not familiar, movies are not familiar, and I'm doing the work of kind of learning it, right, before I can teach it. When I talk to Professor Kim, like it's almost like a embodied knowledge, right? It's like he's lived it, right? So it's always a kind of, again, a privilege to be able to learn from him. So please, let's give Professor Kim a warm welcome.
So let me move over there and respond to the glowing introduction by Professor Chung. I'm blushing, really. I got to hold on to this. So let me start by thanking, of course, the host, Professor Ruth Barakoff, for inviting me to Columbia University, a Center for Korean Research. And I'll also like to thank Ms. Julie Kwan for arranging all this. I understand that the hybrid thing, having taught, the Korea Foundation E-School, as Dr. Jung mentioned, for many years, it's always kind of really mind-boggling and almost frazzled just before starting every class or every event like this in hybrid mode. So hopefully everything goes well today, and I'll do my best. Although I came here pretty late due to security and all that, and then didn't really have time to prepare all these things and put them all together, but hopefully, it's going to all work out. And also, of course, Professor Chung, who, told you about how we met and how we sort of started working together for many, many years. I got to correct him just on one point, because I consider him an old, comrade. And he just told you that we met 5 years ago, which is not true. I think he missed, he's just skipped over 2 years of pandemic. So 7 years ago, I think that was the 2018, book manuscript workshop. And finally, the book, although at the time the book wasn't quite ready at all, I had not even a couple of sample chapters, which is almost a requirement. Well, I had one chapter, sort of, and another one was just a vague idea and all that. And then still, they, accepted the proposal, and that's how we, first met. And ever since, we've been working together very closely. And of course, he was the one who brought me to Columbia for the first time to give a talk at the university seminar, although this was during the pandemic. So we couldn't really do it, this way in person. And at the time, it was still work in progress, the book. Although by that time, I think I had, at least 3 chapters in writing and a couple more to finish things up. So afterwards, I think that was 3 years ago. So in 3 years, finally, the book came out, thankfully, the late last year. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So without further ado, let me share screen here and start talking about the book. Yeah, it's okay. Okay. Thank you, questions. That's the very last slide. Go all the way back. Okay, here, this is the title slide of my talk. Polarizing Dreams is, of course, the main title of the book, and Polarizing Dreams of Gangnam and their Desolate Beauty, which I will explain a little more as we go on, in ferroconcrete, concrete and steel, of course. Let me just go right into the book. So here's the flyer of the book, as you see on the screen, and the blown-up cover art. It was published at the end of last year, and the most important thing in this flyer is at the bottom, It says a special event discount, 30% off until August 30th, 2025. I'm sorry, April. So only limited time. And there's a coupon code, 30SPEC. There you go. That's what I was asked by the publisher to talk at the very beginning. So that's what I'm doing here. And the situation with the university press, I guess I am sort of airing my complaint or grief here, but even though it's a nonprofit but it's basically a commercial enterprise. So once you get the point of putting some photo images and copyrighted materials, then you gotta pay for it, right? And also they do marketing and all that, but they rely on authors quite a lot. So they asked me to write my own copy for example, for advertisement purposes. Although I'm not of course professional copywriter, so they do editing. They did edit my writing, but it's pretty much what I wrote in those 2 paragraphs. But it's not really my forte to come up with a very kind of a spiffy boiled down gist of the book. But I tried my best. And then there is a blurb by Professor Hyun-Ok Park, who I really admire as a sociologist myself. And she, I think, did a much better job after reading my manuscript and really concisely put the main point of the book this way. So I'm gonna read that part. So Pil Ho Kim, yours truly, presents Gangnam as a metonym for the dreams and catastrophes of Korean modernity from the 1970s to the present. And I guess it still begs the question to those, especially to those who are not familiar with what Gangnam is and what it represents. So what is this metonymic reference, Gangnam? And although we don't have a big crowd here, let me ask you, let me do a quick audience survey here. So by the show of hand, how many of you are familiar with Gangnam, heard about it, been there, done that, reputation and whatnot? Just don't be shy. Most all of you, that's great. Just a follow-up question quickly. When you hear the name Gangnam, what comes to your mind immediately in a word or 2? Or maybe a sentence, I don't know. Anything? Apartments, good. The song, which song? Gangnam-style by Psy, of course. Anything else? Capitalism, okay. That's also good, and that's what I'm basically talking about in this entire book. Yeah, I mean that's great. So obviously you all passed the test. That you know something about Gangnam, right? So that makes my job really, really easy here. I don't have to explain what it is. But I mean, since I wrote the copies, well, why don't I just read a little bit from that to give you a sense of what it really is, in my opinion. Let me see. So I wrote this. Anyone curious about what makes South Korean pop culture tick should look no further than Gangnam. Celebrated in a song by an unlikely K-pop superstar named Psy in 2012, Gangnam is the epicenter of Hallyu, the Korean wave pop culture. It is an exclusive zone of privilege and wealth that has lured pop culture industry since the 1980s and fueled the aspirations of Seoul's middle class. So all of you are right, basically, besides Gangnam-style, put it in the global cultural map. And it's sometimes called the apartment republic because these high-rise huge apartment complexes, that kind of urban development model really began with Gangnam development. And of course, the capitalism, not just about it's not just the residential area, Gangnam, but it is, there is a concentration of pop culture industry, high-tech industry, and finance industry altogether. So it's it's a huge engine of South Korean economic growth today, right? And of course, the dreams of middle class. That's what I'm really focusing on in this book. Going through these kinds of literary and cinematic and musical representations of it. Okay, finally moving on here. So, whoops. Okay, so here's the table of contents. And let me briefly talk about each chapter by showing you an image associated with it. And in the first chapter, I am almost obligated to begin with the Sehŭi's Gangnam-style, right? And the chapter title is entitled Boomtown Songs on the South of the River. So the implication is, of course, Gangnam-style was not the first song about Gangnam. There are many, many before it. But let's talk about this image. What is this? What is this monstrosity? Choreo of Gangnam-style dance, whatever you call it, right? Horse trot or horse dance or whatever it is. But why just hands? What's so great about those hands? So this, let me talk about the background of this kind of a bronze statue. And the backstory also. In the background, what you see is a tall building, which figures prominently in the music video. It's World Trade Center building. And just in the front of it is the sort of facade of the building, which I call South Korea's Crystal Palace. That is COEX, the convention center building in Seoul. And that also figures prominently in the Sehŭi's Gangnam style music video too. So altogether, it's a COEX complex, which is kind of really a symbol of South Korean capitalism today. It's a perfect place to commemorate Gangnam Style's global success, and they built this monument sort of. And by day, I mean the municipal government, the Gangnam district office. The problem was that it came 3 years after Gangnam Style, breakthrough. That was 2012. So this was built in 2015. By that time, of course, the frenzy was all but over. So it was a very belated action. So when they approached Psy to build a full statue of Psy doing this dance, and I believe Psy was very, very wise, not to give consent, right? Because he knew that in posterity this is not going to age well. So it's going to be mocked. If his full body dancing the horse dance appears here. So he declined, but they pushed through. I guess they already paid money invested into this, so they couldn't really back out. So they just made these giant hands instead. So that's what happened. Okay, it was a bit of a digression, but from analyzing Psy's music video in this first chapter, I take a route back to South Korean music industry's growth in Gangnam that eventually led to the rise of K-pop. Because as most of you know, I believe that it was Psy's Gangnam Style that opened the floodgate for the other K-pop acts to follow suit, especially in North American market, and that's how I think K-pop really attained this kind of global cachet now that it enjoys now. Okay, moving on to the second chapter, entitled Paradise Across the River. I am stepping into the field of literature, which I still consider myself a kind of a dilettante or novice. And again, going back to the 70s and 80s to show some of the heavyweights like Cho Sehŭi and Park Wan-seo, taking a critical look at the birth of Gangnam. But I begin this chapter with a 1980s protest poem by Kwak Jae-gu, originally titled Songji Jang터, or Songji Marketplace. The protest song adaptation of that protest poem came up with a different title, taken from the refrain of the poem, which is Coca-Cola. So the satirical bite of the poem itself and the song resonate with this art piece, I believe, by the great Minjung artist Oh Yoon, entitled Marketing 5, Painting of Hell, 지옥도. And that features a Coca-Cola can and logo in this kind of a recreation of modern South Korea as a fiery hell in Buddhist conception. Chapter 3, moving on, is a kind of eco-criticism on Gangnam, practiced most prominently by writer Cho Sehŭi in the 1980s, and more recently by the filmmaker Bong Joon-ho. The chapter title, Two Lakes in Chamsil, refers to Cho Sehŭi's description of Seokcheon Lake in Chamsil. It's seen here neatly divided in two. This was well before the Lotte conglomerate built its amusement park and then 123-story skyscraper called Lotte World Tower, which graces the cover of my book, the top image. And this chapter will be the focus of my talk today. So moving on, chapter 4 continues with one of the themes from the chapter 3, the previous chapter, and that is disasters. Specifically focuses on the worst man-made civilian disaster in Korean history, that is the Sampoong department store collapse in 1995. And by discussing the literary introspection into this disaster, I wanted to highlight how the disaster revealed the lack of solidarity, especially that of affective solidarity, as feminist scholars put it, in South Korean society at the time and in subsequent disasters. So this image I chose for my book, instead of any kind of a typical disaster, spectacular disaster images like rubbles or people being pulled out of the rubbles, kind of dramatic rescue scene and all this, is telling because in the sense that the majority of the victims of the disaster are actually not the rich customers, but rather workers, and especially dispatched workers, not even regular employees of this luxury department store in the heart of Gangnam. So in the picture, the mourner is an elderly woman, apparently by her looks of modest means, and it was photographed on the street just across the, from the disaster site. So on the one hand, that's not shown here is the rubble, and she is crying inconsolably, although there are a couple of people trying to console her, and you can see the the toilet paper and the newspaper strewn across over the street and all that. Okay. Gangnam has been beset with scandals, sexual and violent in nature, since its birth. So chapter 5 is a journey into this netherworld. The title, Place Maketh Man, is meant to highlight Gangnam's sense of place, a term from human geography, which tends to foster social evil. One of the films that depict such evil sense of place that Gangnam exudes is Yeon Sang-ho's animation, debut animation, which is lesser known than his later blockbuster films called King of Pigs. And in this particular scene, the character Chul on the right, and I would call him archy anti-hero, if you could call him that, and he is turning himself into an evil monster by stabbing a stray cat. In chapter 6, I changed the course a bit by including an ethnographic study of Gangnam's interesting small neighborhoods, where a kind of classic gentrification pattern emerged in the 2010s. So this is sort of in my wheelhouse as a sociologist. The image here is an iconic cafe named the Bloom and Gute, which led this pattern markedly different from the high-rise dominated landscape of Gangnam in the 20th century. So in this chapter and the following conclusion, I am trying to find some signs and attempts to transform a place like Gangnam and cope with the global forces of social polarization that Gangnam came to represent. So that's kind of a brief overview of the book. And let me just dive right into today's talk. More specifically, I entitled "Ferroconcrete Dreams and Their Desolate Beauty," and I'll be talking about two people specifically, and one is Cho Sehŭi with his sort of burgeoning eco-criticism in his 1970s and 80s work, to Young-Jun Lee, a photographer and photography critic of South Korea, and self-styled machine critique. Well, you got to read this book to understand what he means by machine criticism, but that's not today's focus of today's talk. So let me just go on to it. So as I said, today's talk is about modern urban life materialized in concrete, its ecology, beauty, and social conflict. It's an imaginary tour in space and time, and the main guide is the late great writer Cho Sehŭi, and backed up by the acclaimed filmmaker Bong Joon-ho. And then there is photographer Young-Jun Lee, who's providing a counterpoint to Cho Sehŭi's fierce critique of South Korea's ferroconcrete dreams of capitalist urbanization. And the tour's starting point is Chamsil. Chamsil was an island on the Han River. In the Joseon Dynasty era, this area was known for mulberry trees grown there to raise silkworms. And the name Chamsil, or Jamwon-dong, another name located in Gangnam, that came from this origin as raising silkworms and the royal chamber that create this kind of silk making. So the Han River split into two streams around the island of Chamsil, Sincheon to the north and Songpa to the south, before merging again to flow westward. Gangnam development changed the entire area by turning Sincheon, once a dry stream, into the main river and reclaiming land from Songpa to attach Chamsil to the Gangnam side. This gigantic undertaking of civil engineering, followed by the construction of the 1988 Olympic Games main stadium and massive apartment complexes, completely changed the landscape of Chamsil to where its original form was no longer recognizable. And that's what Cho Sehŭi is talking about. So he bluntly describes Chamsil in the beginning passage of "There is no dandelion." It's a short cautionary tale about environmental conservation in time travel, a book published in 1983, and that is the sequel to his magnum opus, The Dwarf. So let me read the passage out loud here. Chamsil is a neighborhood made of sands, sandy land full of sandy apartments. Flooded river waters would strike and sweep across Chamsil in the summer until they built an embankment and poured asphalt on top. Residents of the sandy neighborhood remain unaware. They think of Chamsil as a land for apartment buildings, and they live there because the apartments are there. Continued. What holds Chamsil together is cement and rebar. Remove the ferroconcrete and everything would collapse, and only grains of sand would remain to drift everywhere. Sand grains cannot stick together no matter how desperately they may try. What a sad situation. It is not just the sand. Even with this, Chamsil residents are not grateful for the cement and rebar. But if you meet anyone living in Chamsil, do console them first. They deserve your consolation because they are sand-like people living in sandy apartments on a brutal land of sands. By the way, all the translation is done by me. This book was not translated, is not translated yet. So that's hopefully my, part of my next project. We'll see. Let me just go on. In the subsequent piece, Chamsil has as many as 2 lakes. Cho Sehŭi continues his criticism. And I don't think I put it in the slide because there's too many texts. So I'm just going to read this part. But it's not all brutal through and through. Chamsil has as many as 2 lakes. They used to flow a stream. When they poured dirt over the stream and erased it off the official map, a part of it was spared and turned into the Chamsil Lake. That is Seokcheon Lake you see here in the photo, as it stands today. Originally, there was only 1 lake, but they are also extracted soil in the middle, splitting it into 2. The stream disappeared. 2 lakes appeared. In fact, these are inaccuracies. To be exact, the stream only disappeared from the official map. Its flow was just diverted. We don't know where the stream flows under the sands or under which apartment buildings its waters run. The stream is likely meandering underground after disappearing from the map. So, in his magnum opus, The Dwarf, Cho Sehŭi had previously criticized the environmental toll Korea's rapid industrialization had taken, divulging a strong tendency toward social ecology. Time Travel is a sequel to this, pushing the tendency further to reconsider the human-nature relations. It touches on the main argument of deep ecology by questioning anthropocentrism itself in the following passage from the Two Lakes. So I'll continue. People would not want to stay for more than 10 minutes by the side of these lakes, which were made by cutting off the waterhead of the stream, now meandering underground. They are lakes in name only and do not at all resemble actual lakes. They are too small and pathetic. Surrounding grounds are always barren, no matter when one visits there. Nonetheless, the lakes give Chamsil residents a huge comfort. The reason is simple. They make it possible for Chamsil residents to boast of the fact that Chamsil has as many as 2 lakes whenever someone who doesn't know Chamsil wants to ask. Regrettably, much like the city officials, Chamsil residents are clinging to the quantity, not quality, I guess, of living standards. And some of them are even bluffing as if they were living someone else's life. Otherwise, they would know why the stream had to be displaced by the lakes. They don't know the reason. Early last spring, a flock of countless migratory birds came down upon the lakes and then flew away. It was a flock of winter migratory birds making its way back north after flying to somewhere south of our country in the fall and staying through the winter. Their mating instincts brought them back north. They breed in the cold region. It's unknown whether the 2 small lakes were used as an area for feeding or resting. Nothing is known of the migratory route. The birds that flew back in the pitch-dark night sky knew of the 2 lakes on the corner of Chamsil, away from the apartment complex. They drew the 2 lakes in their own map. This is the reason that the lakes should now stand there as lakes. So, the narrator expresses a clear derision of the 2 pathetic lakes, described as a side effect of rapacious urban planning, and yet acknowledges their essential purpose for the migratory birds, not for the human residents. This profound shift of perspective was rare in mid-1980s Korea, where the environmental movement had been launched only a few years prior under the banner of anti-pollution and remained in its infancy. Cho Sehŭi's clairvoyance does not end there either. Observing the wanton destruction of the natural surround, Cho notices something ominous afoot, not just near factories and other places where the poor live, but an impending disaster of people's own making, which might happen to middle-class apartment residents like himself, even in places like Chamsil. That is why the Chamsil residents should be thankful for the ferroconcrete, without which their apartment buildings would crumble into sand. This premonition follows wherever he goes. Most disturbingly, he finds it in the city's very aorta, the Han River. In Dying River, another concise piece on ecological disaster, Cho writes this. I'm going to read this again. Up close, the river's ongoing death was starkly visible. The green color was gone. A mining ship was drawing up pebbles from the darkened riverbed. Another one was scooping sand. Here and there, puddles had been dug up. Filled with polluted water, the river lay groaning on its side. The putrid smell was awful. The heart of our city was rotting away. Big speculators were building a new ruin in our city, leaving even bigger wounds at the heart. We had already killed off a lot of things. We had killed sunlight, moonlight, and starlight, killed the Milky Way, killed roadside trees, killed flowers, killed butterflies, bees, dragonflies, and even fireflies. On any survivors, we'd inflicted damage. So, the list of ecological abuses endured by the Han River is lengthy, spanning more than a half-century. The so-called miracle on the Han dumped an inordinate amount of untreated industrial and domestic wastewater into the river as the city population grew fourfold to 10 million between 1960 and 1990. It had been an open sewer until the first ever wastewater facility began operation in 1976. Even when the city was fresh from hosting the 1988 Olympic Games, raw sewage routinely overwhelmed the 4 treatment facilities. Jeondowan's Han River Comprehensive Development Project transformed the river into an artificial waterway of sorts. It was by far the largest public works project ever attempted to date, with a total of 105,000 tons of rebar and nearly 700,000 sacks of cement. 2 underwater barrages were built for the crucial main purpose of flood prevention by controlling the water level and slowing down the flow. These barrages, one of them located in none other than Chamsil, have been the focal point of controversy over the Han's relatively poor water quality despite the steady improvement of wastewater treatment. So, 30 years after Cho Sehŭi's dire warning, Bong Joon-ho's blockbuster The Host imagines nature exacting a grim retribution in the form of a river monster. The opening sequence of The Host is a fictional reenactment of an actual event at the U.S. Army Yongsan garrison, where toxic formaldehyde from the morgue was illegally dumped into the Han in 2000. In the next sequence, 2 fishermen wade waist deep in the water near the Chamsil underwater barrage and glimpse of a strange fry, which grows into a giant mutant fish later in the film. As the lurking monster attacks from its layers below the huge steel and concrete Han River bridge structures, the fate of the city depends on a tenacious working-class family who confronts the monster in a final showdown. A parallel between the eco-criticism of Cho Sehŭi and Bong Joon-ho is their unflattering treatment of the middle class. Cho's critique focuses on Chamsil residents who are largely ignorant, indifferent, or worse yet, mistakenly boastful about the environmental consequences while reaping benefits from the Han River development. In Bong's film, the middle class is portrayed at best as hapless victims, like the picnickers falling prey to the monster at the Riverside Park. Bong Joon-ho's sardonic critique of Korea's class divide is formative through The Host, just like his Oscar-winning film Parasite. At first blush, the working-class family in Parasite appears diametrically opposed to that from The Host, even though both are anchored by the father character played by Song Kang-ho. They are anti-hero figures at best, if not villains or monsters, who cheat, deceive, conspire, and ultimately kill and are killed. And yet their vice mirrors many of the defects of the middle class, especially those who aspire to elevate themselves to the elite status. Bong Joon-ho sprinkles subtle clues in the film, suggesting that the Kims used to be a solid member of the rising middle class before being ruined by the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Presumably having fallen off the social ladder, the Kims are relegated to the semi-basement, or banjiha, and the elaborate ruse they play in order to live off on the Parks reaches a breaking point when torrential rain causes a disastrous flood of consequences, literally as well as figuratively. To the affluent Parks, the downpour is only a nuisance that made them cut short a weekend getaway. It turns into a devastating flood, a classic revenge of nature that wreaks havoc on the lives of those who fell from the middle class into the ranks of basement dwellers like the Kims. Ultimately, Parasite is a parable of the middle class devouring themselves in the face of a catastrophe co-created by natural and social forces. So, change gears here. In his photo essay book, Fretful City, or 초조한 도시, the photographer and critic Young-jun Lee makes a controversial argument for class, or gyok, in Ferroconcrete. Here, class is an aesthetical term not to be confused with social class, or 계급. The class in concrete is an example of what he calls desolate beauty, or sangmangmi. And Young-jun Lee finds it in plenty in Seoul's urban landscapes. The overabundance of concrete structures have been roundly panned as an unsavory legacy of authoritarian-era architecture. But Young-jun Lee sees a certain hypocrisy in the fashionable disavowal of concrete for, quote, being dreary, spewing toxin, and ruining the environment, among other things, even as it carries the weight of the modern world on its shoulders. And really, Young-jun Lee is not really a crank who just loves brutalist architecture. He has beautiful photos to prove his point, one of which I used in the title slide of this very presentation, and another in my own book. But a prominent example of Lee's argument can be found in Bong Joon-ho's blockbuster film, The Host, once again going back to that, which illustrates the horrific, desolate beauty of Han River bridges, as you can see in this slide. Furthermore, Young-jun Lee dramatically raises the stake by focusing on those bridges, especially the one associated with a tragic event. And that's the Seongsu Bridge, which collapsed less than a year before the huge Sanpung collapse. Right? And here is a quote from Lee's book. Compared to the other Han River bridges, the Seongsu Bridge has massively voluminous piers and a painful backstory attached to them. Needless to say, I'm referring to the trauma of the collapse. Photographs of the collapse show that only the deck slab fell down. Nevertheless, the reconstruction expanded the bridge, including the piers. It is a bitter irony that the fat, sturdy-looking piers of Seongsu came as a result of the traumatic accident, end quote. So the Seongsu Bridge collapse takes us to yet another film, which is director Kim Bora's debut feature. And I understand director Kim Bora is Columbia alum, so probably many of you know her work. And in this film, of course, the bridge collapse figures in as a major turning point. So it's a story loosely based on the filmmaker's own childhood, and Hummingbird garnered universal accolades. This international acclaim was a major achievement for the perennially underfunded independent film industry, contributing to South Korean cinema's banner year that culminated with Bong Joon-ho winning the Oscars with Parasite, right? And these two film narratives, they came in the same year, right? Converge on the themes of social class played out at the level of intimate personal relationships, although they cannot be more different from each other in terms of tone and style. Parasite is a crisply shot satire with Hitchcockian alterations of humor and suspense. In contrast, the hazy cinematography of Hummingbird presents a moving coming-of-age story with the joys and sorrows of adolescence. The earnest tone of Hummingbird and the main character, Eun-hee's emotional honesty, renders more humanized, albeit imperfect characters in her surround. So at this point, why don't we watch a short trailer of the film? Let me take a little while here. First, I'm going to stop share. Then share the media player.
아빠 뭐 입고 왔어?
부끄럽게 뭐가 부끄러? 어? 아유, 내.
선생님은 자기가 싫어진 적이 있으세요?
너 미친 거 아니야? 미안하다 말도 안 하냐?
여러분이 아는 사람들 중에 속마음을 아는 사람은 몇 명이나 될까요?
Let me share the. So the main character, the girl Eun-hee, lives in a 1,200 square foot apartment, which is a uniform size for the 4,424 units of the gigantic Eunma apartment complex. And she lives with her parents and two older siblings, a brother and a sister. Her parents run a small rice mill. So Eun-hee is a, quote, a daughter from the mill, a lowly working class kid in status-obsessed Gangnam. Hummingbird unflinchingly takes on difficult aspects of the teenage girl's life. Eun-hee's emotions may be in frequent turmoil, but the film maintains an even keel until a disaster upends the tenuous balance. Just like many other families in Gangnam, Eun-hee's family lives there primarily for college prep education, and in their case, it is specifically for Eun-hee's brother, the family's quote-unquote golden boy, who aspires to enter the nation's top-ranked university. Eun-hee's sister, on the other hand, is the proverbial black sheep, who somehow failed to secure a spot in the prestigious Gangnam School District and instead attends a high school across the river. As opposed to the imperious brother, Eun-hee gets along fine with her sister, who only plays a minor role in her life until the day of disaster. Upon hearing the news of the Sangsu Bridge collapse at school, Eun-hee instantly realized that the sister may have been on her way to school crossing the very bridge and goes into panic. This fictional crisis is based on, of course, the terrible reality that 8 students of Muhak Girls High School perished on that fateful morning, all of whom were commuting daily by bus from Gangnam, just like Eun-hee's sister. From the tragedy, Eun-hee emerges stronger and more clear-eyed about her place in family, school, and society at large, and simply put, she grows older. So, teenagers get stronger as they grow older, typically, but buildings do not. Some structures may mature gracefully, even if they are made of gray concrete, in line with Young Jun Lee's notion of desolate beauty. However, the concrete buildings of Eunma, as you can see in this screenshot, along with most other apartment complexes built before the Asian financial crisis, did not really age well. So if the lifespan of an apartment was similar to that of a horse, which is about 25 years, I understand, what did an Eunma apartment look like when it was at 15 years of age? A gracefully matured building with the desolate beauty of gray concrete? The celebrated cinematography of Hummingbird may provide an answer. So at this point, I'd like to show you the cold open for the film.
왔어? 벌써 이거밖에 없었어? 조금 쉬는 거 같은데. 가게 아줌마 없었어? 아저씨만 계시네?
So what happened there? Can anybody guess? I think I intentionally didn't add the subtitles there, but you probably can figure out even if you don't understand the Korean language, what went on there. Basically, she was on the wrong floor, right? And why did that happen? The last scene is a kind of a panning out of the scene, and you see these almost identical apartment units in each floor. So even if you're a resident living there for many years, you get confused sometimes. And this is not just a fictional account. There are many, but this is kind of a cliche almost in apartment genre, whether in literature or in film, and it actually happens in real life, especially for elderly and young kids who just moved into this kind of apartments. So basically, that's what's really surprising, I guess, to those who are not living in this kind of apartment republic type of situation. But also, I'd like to point out the aesthetics of this film. That's the whole point I'm trying to make here. So the film's mise en scène is realistic, as the filming location and story setting are both in my apartments. But there is a catch. That is a 23-year time lapse between the story setting in 1994 and the actual shooting in 2017. Walls with deep cracks, peeling paints. Let me just get back to the, by the way, forgot about this. Okay, going back to the right-hand side image. So walls with deep cracks, peeling paint, and discoloration from mold are all disturbing signs of aging and disrepair, even for the 40-plus-year-old Imma complex of today, let alone the 15-year-old concrete structure portrayed in the film's 1990s setting. The deliberately unkempt visuals imply that Imma is little changed since the early 1990s, at least in the collective memory of those who lived in the apartment complex or knew it well enough. So I think I'm going over time here, but sort of instead of conclusion, I'd like to show you one more image, and this is, of course, the two lakes in Chamsil today, where 123 super skyscraper Lotte World Tower that I mentioned is standing. And without further commentary, let me end by quoting the final lines of Cho Sehŭi's "There are as many as two lakes in Chamsil." The stream lost its place and departed. The stream meanders underground. Two lakes appeared in place of the stream. Now the two lakes have to stand there as lakes. Had they known this, Chamsil residents should have said it a bit louder. There are as many as two lakes in Chamsil. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for your wonderful talk. So we're going to kind of slip right into the Q&A. The folks of you joining online, I believe that there's a Q&A box that you can input your questions if you have any. But right now, I mean, I have some questions myself, but I'd like to open it up for the audience.
Should I stand here or should I move to?
If you make yourself comfortable, yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you.
There's water. Does anybody have questions? I feel like I can tell from the faces that something's on the tip of their tongue, but not quite forming. So I can start. Could I actually ask by, let me go back to, yeah, do I have to reshare? So there was that great quote from Hyunwook Park that was kind of summing up the book. And it reminded me of something that I was thinking about as I was reading your book. Slideshow. So Professor Kim presents Gangnam as a metonym for the dreams and catastrophes of Korean modernity from the 1970s to the present. And I was thinking about, I mean, it's certainly true, but I was also thinking about how, in many ways, a certain kind of global branding that's emerged from the Gangnam genre has gone beyond the limits of Korean modernity to become kind of an allegory about capitalism in general, right? And I think in the introduction of your book, you talk about that, right? So in some ways, the Gangnam style has kind of become passé, right? It's kind of dated now already. People kind of smirk when you bring it up, especially when I teach, pop culture courses to younger students. They kind of get it, but they don't get it. They kind of mock it in a way. But at the same time, it still has currency because, as Professor Kim says, it kind of launched a genre of media that critiques capitalism, but also kind of thrives from it, right? And kind of becomes a global kind of meme, right? And you see that there's a kind of a through line that you can find from Gangnam Style all the way through like Parasite and Squid Game. They're very different genres, and yet they have that kind of critical capitalism that also functions as a kind of a form of spectatorship of disaster. So I think what I was picking up from your book is that there's polarization of dreams, but there's also kind of polarization of aesthetics and modes of critique that emerge out of that genre, which is like radically kind of binary, right? One is the kind of the miracle of Han narrative, which celebrates how far South Korea has come. And everybody's always talking about, if you're not familiar with modern Korean history, South Korea, they're punching above their weight. They're a cultural powerhouse. Everybody wants to go there. People are obsessed with Korea. Korean, language enrollment is going up. So that's the sort of the positive side. And then there's the stark negative side, right? Where people talk about, again, the wealth disparity, people being left behind. And of course, the media that kind of critique that wealth disparity tend to focus more on that, the problematic elements of inequality and oppression and exploitation, right? So I guess the question that I would like to ask is that, do you find a kind of a middle ground or a different kind of aesthetic emerging within that polarization, right, of dreams and catastrophe, right? In some ways, is that kind of polarization of dreams and catastrophe getting in the way of more honest critique? Maybe some might call it reformist, but I think in some ways, like focus on everyday life, right? The smaller, kind of quieter elements of life in South Korea, even though that might not translate as well as something like Squid Game or Parasite, could have more to say, right? And is there a way in which the catastrophe aesthetic is drowning that out? So I just wanted to ask a kind of a broader question about that.
Thank you, Professor Chung. I think you are hitting too many nails in the head, so I don't know where to begin. But so Gangnam as not just as a metonym of Korean capitalism, but also kind of a global brand and kind of a, I don't know if we could call it an allegory of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, whatnot. But definitely, I think it's a kind of a very attractive phantasmagoria of 21st century, capitalism coming out of East Asia, and it's at the forefront of it in many ways. And in terms of this kind of a through line across different genres, again, I totally agree that there is something of a of a through line, and that's what I try to sort of capture by going through this kind of different genres in just in a single chapter in some cases. Although I guess each chapter has some focus on this or that genre, so to speak. And I guess that kind of through line is directly related to your next question, which is about aesthetics and polarization of it. And the polarization of aesthetics is not something that I actually originally present here, but rather I am citing this kind of utopia, dystopia, double vision mentioned by, of course, Susan Buck-Morss. But even before that, I think Mike Davis, when he talked about Los Angeles in City of Quartz, which I got to read much later in the process, and I found I should have read this much earlier, because LA, in so many ways, very different from Gangnam, but there is definitely some kind of parallel between them, which is really kind of fascinating thing. Yeah, so there are these kinds of, I think, precedents when it comes to this kind of a utopia, dystopia, thing, and that's why I think I went back to, Benjamin to get some, theoretical inspiration. But as you said, is there a sort of a middle ground where you can actually bridge between these two, poles, right? I try to find those kind of, signals from, various, materials that I went through. And my focus was, of course, bridging, right? And the bridge collapse, I think, means a whole lot in that sense. Symbolic, collapse, bridge between the north side and south side, which would mean, of course, the breaking of this kind of a cross-class alliance, which I thought of as a kind of a allegory of what happened in the, what happened in the South Korean democracy movement when the workers were raising their voices soon after the breakthrough in 1987. The middle class started backing off, and that's where you see, Gangnam's political, conservatism, raising its head. So in that sense, I think, even aesthetically speaking, this kind of a new style or aesthetics should have something to do with, finding a kind of a common ground for, solidarity, cross-class solidarity, or, gender solidarity, or whatever you call it. And that's why I think the House of Hummingbird is kind of an exemplary, film to try to show the possibility of it, but on the other hand, the brutality of this kind of broken, solidarity. And I mentioned I'm not a cinema scholar. I'm not trained that way. But even in terms of cinematography, I think it's quite different from the approach of Parasite, which I try to highlight there. And maybe I don't know if there is a kind of a specific visual or musical style that directly addresses this kind of bridging between the two polarizing camps, or whatever you call it, or classes. But hopefully we can find those kind of possibilities in many different works beside House of Hummingbird. Yeah, and again, I think it's a great point that focus on everyday life, which is what the House of Hummingbird is really all about. It's a life story of a young teenage girl. So when I was really floored by this film, my wife actually was couldn't really understand. What do you know about teenage girls, really, right? I try to sort of explain that I've been through kind of very similar experiences growing up in Gangnam although I think the setting was, for me, it was 10 years prior, even the earlier period of Gangnam. So the setting was quite different, but all these kinds of basic setup was already there. So I could definitely sort of understand and empathize, with the main character there.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. When I kind of think of Gangnam, I also think of it in a very temporal realm, where it's kind of a site where time travel is almost possible, because it seems like people in Gangnam are always trying to go really, really fast, or they are kind of stepping over a particular process to reach the end goal beforehand. And I think particular industries I'm thinking of, like the plastic surgery industry, that also got started flourishing in the 90s, or the Hagwon culture that we also see in House of Hummingbird. And I guess one reason I really enjoyed House of Hummingbird was because I liked how it transposed Korea's almost coming of age with Eunhee's coming of age, and it makes this Korean desire to want to grow up and turn into a developed country much more, I guess, relatable to an individual level, because we see how much Eunhee's trying to become pretend as if she's an adult by going to these nightclubs and trying to have these relationships with her boyfriend. And so I think it's kind of a big question, but because there's all this speeding up that is happening in Gangnam, what would you, I think maybe you touched on this a little bit with the previous question, but how would you say that, is there a possibility for a nation or a society to slow down? Or is it once you have sped up, it's just either maintaining that or stagnating that speed, or just going even faster?
Well, thank you for the question. The temporality thing, I think, is really fascinating, I think, and the time travel you mentioned. And it just so happened that Cho Sehŭi's second book is the time travel. That's the title, which may not be just a coincidence, I guess. And in that book, he is in 1983, basically, jumping ahead and maybe sort of foreseeing what's happening in the two lakes, right? And now we have this kind of a huge skyscraper, built there. The speed of life in South Korea is really fast, most of you know. And if you are a frequent visitor like myself, every year it sort of changes, right? So if you live in there, then you don't really feel it that way. But if you go there every year, you see a kind of incremental change, which is quite big. And then if you go there for the first time in 10 years, then it's a different country, basically. But I think that kind of really fast track is unfortunately or fortunately coming to an end, and should probably come to an end for its own good now. And in many ways, they really need to slow down. Otherwise, this kind of rapid urban redevelopment, especially pioneered in Gangnam, is gonna hit kind of a certain physical limit, I believe. I'm mostly talking about the apartments, right? And I try to show you that the Imma apartment, which is still, the complex is still standing. It's about now, let's see. It's about 40, coming close to half-century mark, and it's in desperate state. But there is no way out, basically, to redevelop it. The whole the scheme of redevelopment in South Korean places like Gangnam is wholesale demolition and building up new buildings, bigger in size, taller. That way, economically, it makes sense. And it doesn't always work, even in places like Gangnam. So places like where my parents live, or in my apartment complex, those are really old and really run down places. And they are still very expensive on paper. but it's really hard to sell because nobody really wants to live in those kind of rundown apartments. The water doesn't come out pretty well, and all these kinds of problems they have. But they are holding on to it because there's a lot of money at stake, right? So all these kinds of things show that there is a certain limit to do this kind of cycle again and again and again. But they are trying anyway, and let's see what happens there. Yeah, a lot of things. Culturally, plastic surgery, Hagwon culture, and which Gangnam started, and they're still holding on to these kinds of things. Again, all these scandals that Gangnam is being a center of in these last, I think, a decade or so, has a lot to do with these kinds of industries, right? And in the book, I try to point out that South Korea's pop culture industry, whether K-pop or drama, and all these things are concentrated in Gangnam. And that has a very, very close relationship with sex industry. Sex industry is probably even bigger than the Korean pop culture industry. And they have this kind of cohabitation in Gangnam. So everything points to some kind of reform, which should be done before even bigger scandals are breaking out in Gangnam. And there are the scandals just keep coming.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you about this idea of Gangnam being sort of the aspiration for Koreans. It's always kind of, I guess purely even in finance, with your finance situation, living in Gangnam seems to give you this status symbol almost. So therefore, it is very easy to mock for those who are not there. And I was just wondering, because this phenomenon of Gangnam has existed at this point almost 40, as you said, 40, 50 years. Has there been what is sort of the view these days? Is it still simply absolute rejection of that lifestyle, or making fun of it versus really wanting it? What do you think is kind of the attitude towards Gangnam these days? Is it still viewed as aspirational? Is it viewed as this sort of weird, the capitalist society that we all kind of try to shun, but somehow we still live in? Do you think that attitude is changing among the younger generation? Do they still view, living in Gangnam as that kind of the goal? What do you think is changing? If there has been any shift in the attitude towards, especially for Koreans when they think of Gangnam and what that means?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There was definitely kind of a watershed moment when it comes to Gangnam and what it represents in South Korean capitalist development, and that was, of course, the Asian financial crisis, or IMF crisis, 1997. Prior to that, I would say, of course, the cracks had been shown since the sort of collapses, for example, physical collapses of Seongsu and Sampung were showing that things to come, basically. And what came down was, of course, economic meltdown, right? Gangnam survived, like the rest of the country, but things definitely changed. So prior to that, and I start the book with, Gangnam's dream being kind of a middle-class dream, kind of a, I would say, bastardized version of American dream. But since the economic crisis, that was, out of the question, basically. And then what happened was this kind of a fracture in the middle class that Gangnam sort of proffered as kind of a, a model for South Korean capitalism up until that point, up until the, sort of turn toward neoliberalization. And of course, from that point on, I guess, the, people's view on Gangnam really, sort of diversifies in many different ways. I would say there's definitely this kind of aspiration and envy thing still there. And especially if you are, let's say, in the 30s and 40s, and you see that, your peers who happen to have a rich, parent or, lucky enough to get a, apartment house in Gangnam, even though you are kind of a start in the same starting point, you see this kind of a huge gap between yourself and your peer living in Gangnam. So there's that kind of I guess that brews definitely envy and resentment, and that's a big part of what they view in Gangnam. On the other hand, those who grew up in Gangnam, the newer, younger generation, they may not see Gangnam as in the same way that their parents' generation would do, but rather, I guess they set their sight higher, especially if they sort of survive the IMF crisis, meaning that they are sort of aspiring themselves into this kind of a global elite, and many of them actually have extensive experience studying abroad in the Anglophone countries, or spending some time in Europe and places like that. So, for example, novelist Kim Sehŭi's main work. In Heaven, or 천국에서, showing that this close friends living growing up in Chamsil, which is main part of Gangnam, after IMF crisis, sort of diverge in terms of their life path, and especially the one that succeeds and become a kind of becomes global elite. To her, Gangnam, she still lives in Gangnam, but it's not the only place, and it doesn't seem like she is really kind of proud of living in Gangnam anymore, right? That kind of attitude, I think, is showing more and more among the younger, more cosmopolitan segment of South Korean youth population. Many of them still live in Gangnam or are being educated in Gangnam.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. I learned. I also have to mention that I bought a book without the discount code, so I should have known the code sooner. Because Ruth told me like, "Oh, you are coming," so I thought like I would definitely read the book before your talk, but I didn't get a chance to read your book. But still, I was when I actually was going to. When I was ordering your book on the Amazon.com, and then I saw your the book cover featuring the Lotte Tower, which was a little bit shocking to me because first that actual photo was exactly the view I'm actually looking at from my home. So my home is located just north of the Lotte, the Chamsil area. And then second of all, when I think about Gangnam these days, especially Chamsil area is somehow kind of very ambiguous territories among the Koreans' perception. So I'm just curious, just really that my rudimentary question: what is Gangnam? The Gangnam actually covers the vast amount of the area just south of the Han River. So when I think about the Gangnam and people think about the Gangnam, and they always think of this liberalism and the luxury and the capitalism going on, but the vast majority of the Gangnam area actually quite apart, remote from this kind of trend. So can you just comment on this?
Thank you. Why don't I share the image again, book cover. There's something to talk about here, I guess, before answering your question. Okay, so this And Professor Jong Kim mentioned that this is, of course, the tower that she can see from her home. I envy her. This is a really nice, nighttime, skyline of Seoul. And, these apartments are all, most of these are redeveloped luxury, higher-rise apartments, 20, 30 stories now on the side. So they command like, I don't know, easily several $1 million nowadays in terms of price. Right below here, you see that the kind of a utopia dystopia image that I sort of a contrast that I try to make throughout the book. And this is the in the background through the smoke you can see the Tower Palace, which is Samsung conglomerates luxury apartment complex. Again, just like Lotte and Chamsil, this is sort of a crown jewel of Gangnam today. But there is this kind of a fire, which took place in village called Guryong Village. That is actually shanty town, and that's just 1.5 kilometers, just about a mile away from this luxury apartment complex. So that shows that Gangnam, in reality, in physical reality, is quite complex because, as Professor Kim just mentioned, in terms of administrative district, Gangnam, it consists of, I think, 3 different, administrative districts. And some of them cover this kind of undeveloped, areas, which, is always a kind of sort of a focus of these, developers who want to, encroach into this kind of a green belt zones that are still intact and build nice apartments so that they can make a lot of money. But, even in places like Gangnam, it's not all evenly developed. So there are some pockets like this where poor and working class people live. It has always been like that from the 80s all through today. In the House of Hummingbird, going back to that film, actually, the main character and her teacher pass by this development zone and see the protesters, hanging banners. We're not going to go away to the death of till our death, and all these kinds of things, which are still happening. For example, when I visited Gangnam area in 2005 or 6, this was when the outer space of Gangnam was being developed. I'm talking about Pangyo or Bundang, these areas, which are now considered sort of I guess, the second Gangnam, so to speak. So Gangnam in Korean people's minds is not really identical to the physical district or districts, but rather this kind of a mode of development, urban development, and who live in that place and these sort of things. So you can see Gangnam popping up in anywhere and everywhere, not everywhere, but in other places beyond Seoul, for example. Haeundae in Busan, for example, is a nice beach town where they have this kind of 40, 50 story high-rise apartment buildings nowadays. I guess that's Gangnam of Busan and all that. So many urban sociologists in Korea wrote books, many books on Gangnam and its urban development, and one of them really touch upon what you just said. So in their mind, Gangnam is quite different than what the map geography says. So basically, the Chamsil is part of Songpa district, but only 1/3 of Songpa district is considered part of Gangnam, and that is the stadium and its around. There are luxury apartments and all that. The rest of Songpa is actually not considered Gangnam, and that sort of bears out when they surveyed people and they drew this sort of what do they call it? So sort of mind map of Gangnam, and that's quite different from the physical boundaries of Gangnam.
Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if we kind of flipped what we thought of as utopia and dystopia, and if we thought of Gangnam as more like the dystopia, do you feel like there's a neighborhood that might be closer to a utopia, like maybe a slower kind of a, lifestyle? And then if you think that such a neighborhood exists, do you feel like it's viable? Like, would it survive with that lifestyle kind of more long term?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think I was asked similar questions, before when I talk about, Gangnam, not just, this, particular, part of the book. But I think this part is actually closely related to the answer that I'm trying to give you here. Basically, this concrete aesthetics have been criticized very harshly. Young-Jun Lee's counterpoint notwithstanding, but I mean that was sort of the majority sense now, especially nowadays. They just don't like concrete style apartments anymore. So nowadays they are trying different styles of high-rise apartments. You can definitely compare those that were built after, let's say 2005 or so, with the 1980s, 1990s buildings. There's definitely sort of attempt to sort of get out of this kind of very cookie cutter identical style apartment buildings. But even beyond that, I think, and that's the topic that I focus on in chapter 6 with this kind of classic gentrification, which typically means these young artistic types, right? Cafe owners, artisans. They go into this rundown areas and prettify these areas, and then that's sort of beginning of gentrification. So that sort of thing started happening in the mid to late 2000s and picked up its speed in the 2010s in Seoul. Probably the best example many of you know is near the old downtown where royal palaces are, Bukchon, Seocheon, these kinds of places. I guess that was sort of looked upon as a kind of an alternative, if not utopia. Slow lifestyle, and then small scale, and all these kinds of bohemian, utopian, ideals that were built into this. And very interestingly, this sort of spreads out, right, through 2010s and I think in the early 2010s, and then throughout the 2010s, and you see even in Gangnam, some people go into some of these pockets of Gangnam where development was not really done in a kind of a massive apartment complex style, and do their things. Not all of them succeed, basically, but these were kind of a very interesting and different spatial practice, I would say, that shows a kind of change. And I would probably need to go back and check what they are doing nowadays and how successful it was. But definitely, I think that there is a sort of a changing sense or sensibility of what would be ideal urban development going forward.
On the topic of utopia and dystopia, I actually had one more question. Did you see the film Concrete Utopia? It's one of those movies that, as I was watching, I was like, if this came out 10 years ago, it would totally be in Pil Ho Kim's book. Do you have a take on that?
Concrete Utopia is actually a title of a book written by Park Hae-chun, who's a very well-respected, sort of urban culture scholar in Korea. And I read that book, and I think I had some, I got some inspiration from that book. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the film version yet, which I don't think is, because the book is a cultural studies book. It doesn't have that kind of narrative, but I guess inspired, loose sense by that kind of apocalypse, right? So I mean to watch that film, but for personal reasons, I have been just postponing it. So I probably shouldn't make any comment on it without watching it.
Hi. I was just wondering, the quote that you provided for the Cho Sehŭi novel was really fascinating. I was just wondering about the narrative mode that seems to be playing out there. It seems almost as if he's not really talking about concrete as if it's like the modern industrial material. Like his quote is starting from the sand, the elements, the raw material. And then he's saying, okay, apartment is just like a collection of sands taken together. And then his story about the two lakes appearing also seems to have some kind of feeling of almost like a myth. I was just wondering, since we had already talked of like the temporality of it, I was wondering if you saw those kind of like Cho Sehŭi's narrative in that to be pointing towards a temporal rupture, or is it more like, okay, there's actually a continuity where I need to do this move of consciously not working with language that seems modern?
Well, thank you. That's a very tough question for a non-literary scholar to answer. But first thing I would say is that Cho Sehŭi's time travel, supposedly a kind of a fictional book, sequel to The Dwarf. It's not actually fictional narrative. For the most part, no. So these are bunch of collected essays, and those are the things that I read for the most part. There is a novella called Time Travel, and that's why the book itself was titled Time Travel. But this novella is unfinished, and he passed away, so it remains unfinished. And you can, if you read the entire book, then you can understand why. He was struggling mightily to produce a kind of a worthy, sequel to The Dwarf, and that was a tough task. And he was sort of, again, this is my sort of a symptomatic reading of it, moving toward more kind of back to the roots, his own roots as a journalist, as a sort of a, as Youngju Ryu put it in her book, the literature witness. So that's why he decided to actually, drop his pen and then take up his camera and become a kind of a photojournalist, in his, sort of third book and afterwards. He didn't write anymore. So you can definitely see that many of these, very short pieces are about his, thoughts, and specifically focused on this environmental destruction that he already started lamenting in The Dwarf. And that's, I think, what cuts through the most of the, pieces in this collection of, short writings, whether it's fictional or not. So that's the time travel. Because I was really focusing on the, that part of, the book, the eco-criticism part, I really didn't put much thought into time travel, temporality per se. But the major piece of that book was, again, the novella. And this was a kind of a sweeping sort of a time sleep piece about history. So basically, the main character, one of the characters in the Dwarf book, Shine, the middle class, housewife, she goes back in time and sort of reminisce about her experience during the Cold War period. The Korean War period, and going back to her, ancestral times in the colonial period, and so on and so forth. So that's another big part of that book. But in this presentation and in my own book, I just set it aside and focused on this eco-criticism part.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for coming. My name is Dylan, and I'm a second year here at the undergrad college. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on maybe some of the more pressing issues underlying the globalization and the capital success that we have in Korea, and maybe what are the roles of like second generation Korean Americans or even Korean citizens who tend to go overseas and decide to live elsewhere, or even immigrants that come to Korea from other countries, and what are some ways that we can do to combat those pressing issues that seemingly tend to decay the psychological and spiritual health of the country, especially for the next younger generations? What do you think we can do, whether academically or in ways that don't require us to migrate back to Korea?
Well, thank you for those very pressing questions. I don't think I can give you very satisfactory answers to those big questions involving, I guess, the country's future, right? Speaking of the roles that Korean Americans play, especially focusing on Gangnam again, there are many sort of, not just Gangnam nowadays. Really, I mean, if you go to other sort of what's considered gentrified places, then you see a lot of returnees or expats, these kinds of folks. And their roles really vary widely, I would say. Some of them residing in Gangnam, whether they were born in Korea or were born in the States, where they were educated, I guess don't really matter too much nowadays. And the recent phenomenon that really fascinates me is many of these Korean American youth, they strategically go back to Korea, and especially men. They go into military service, South Korean military service. And that way they can keep dual citizenship. And I guess there's a reason for doing so. And a big part of it is, of course, job opportunities that now South Korea can provide. And that, in these days, I think have become really those become really kind of enticing opportunities for Korean Americans. Who are, I guess, especially if you go to go through military service, and you're probably considered bilingual at that point, because it's to survive in the Korean military. You definitely need very good Korean language skills and social skills and so on. So I think I've seen many of these Korean Americans becoming part of the elite, South Korean elite, the global elite or cosmopolitan elite. But more and more, the citizenship doesn't really matter too much, because many of these homegrown, quote unquote, Korean youths, especially in places like Gangnam, they are cosmopolitan in every sense of the word, right? And they mingle with the global elite quite easily, right? And they become sort of at the forefront of this kind of a South Korean capitalism today. That's one thing, and that definitely there is that aspect to it. On the other hand, you see many of these people who sort of immerse themselves into this kind of a global counterculture or bohemian culture or whatever. They come back to Korea and start this kind of a new practices, new urban practices, like going to these kind of rundown areas in Gangbuk, in downtown, places like Iksan-dong, where it used to be a kind of a brothels and all that, and they start new restaurant, cafes, and things like that, and become a sort of magnet for tourists. There are problems associated with it, gentrification and displacement, for one. But on the other hand, it kind of brings a newer, different sensibility, cultural sensibility, and I think that should be something. I think that is something we should take notice and try to find kind of a if possible, sort of positive side to it. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's going to be really difficult to see any kind of positive aspects among the sort of immigrants from the so-called first world or West, or from the West into South Korea, whether they're ethnically Korean or not. And of course, I haven't even started talking about the immigration, labor immigration from the global South into Korea, and that's a huge problem. And you probably know, as well as I do, what kind of problems it entails, and how South Korea is badly treating them and then trying to take advantage of them.
Thank you so much for your really engaging lecture. I was really interested in Youngjun Lee's photograph and his theory about like the concrete aesthetics. And I think what really interests me is like how his image of the concrete, like it's really requires some kind of really different engagement from like the two images that we're seeing here. And it's almost like really close-up images of like excess, like something like the marks, like traces. And I'm just curious, I was like kind of taken aback by some of the like kind of things that the quote that you brought up from him, how it's almost like romanticizing or aestheticizing the kind of ruins. And I wasn't very feeling like comfortable with the kind of things that he was saying about like how, the beauty, like talking about the beauty, like aestheticizing, like romanticizing and almost kind of nostalgic views of the concrete like structures. But at the same time, I feel like how would you kind of describe the kind of like engagement that this kind of photographs that he's presenting to us, like the really close-up images, that's like we don't even get to see like what it looks like, how the what the bricks looks like, in full. But we are like he's really asking us to look at like this close-up, like traces, like the ruins. And I'm just thinking also about like his like the photography medium as kind of ruins itself, that how it evokes like death and ruin at the same time. So I just wonder that you just mentioned that like his like concrete like aesthetics were like criticized a lot, but also do you see some kind of like political possibility in like his like the way that he's like utilizing this medium, or the way that he's presenting this particular view, for example, that's very different from the like whole landscape view that you showed us like in your cover. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think you should probably invite Youngjun Lee next time and speak for him. He speaks for himself. But the thing is, he's not. I don't think he's nostalgic at all. The criticism was before him, basically, the concrete aesthetics of it, and he was sort of countering that kind of prevalent criticism about concrete aesthetics that sort of dominated, South Korean architecture for a long period of time. And it's not about the kind of ruins, as you can see. This is not this is a functioning, bridge, undergirding the bridge, and he's actually focusing on that. So functioning, urban infrastructure, it has its own beauty. It's not just the concrete. His photographs show, really kind of interesting industrial, structures that in some ways look quite interesting and even you might say beautiful. For example, all these kinds of different power lines or, gas pipes, they make a very interesting, I guess, unintended, kind of a design features. And that's what he was really, talking about in terms of this, sangmangmi or desolate beauty. Although at first blush, there's nothing, really remarkable about these kinds of things. You see it every day passing by. But if you look at it closely, as he does, then there's, these kind of, concrete structures definitely have a kind of a texture, right? Whether intended or not. And, I guess, it has something to do with, I guess, brutalist styles in architecture or something, but he doesn't really make reference to brutalism either. That's been around for, almost, more than a half century now. So he's trying to, point out something that a lot of people actually easily, dismiss. And I guess, we can all disagree. It's another person's taste. So, but at least to me, he has a point, especially this kind of wholesale denunciation with regard to the wholesale denunciation of, concrete, architecture of South Korea. And one more thing I think I forgot to address is the concrete. So when I gave this, I'm giving this talk twice in my whole 10 university book tour. So this is a second time. So it's kind of unpolished yet, but now my tour is coming to an end anyway. But when I gave the first version of this talk at UCLA, I wasn't really intending to give this talk. Actually, I was going to talk about the film Burning. But this was, 2 weeks after the wildfires in LA. So I had to change the topic because I couldn't really talk about it there. So I brought this up and expanded the 20-minute actually, conference presentation into a 50-minute, talk. And very interestingly, so this image was in the poster for the talk, same here in Columbia. And that brought, 2 students from, I think, engineering school, and they identify themselves that way. And they were really intrigued by this title of the talk, Ferroconcrete Dreams. And they were actually telling me and the audience, how environmentally friendly the modern concrete is really. They sort of regenerate themselves in the water and all these kinds of, good things about concrete. So I said, well, your point is well taken, basically, and that's what I was sort of getting at by bringing in Youngjun Lee, who was basically speaking about the same thing. The concrete, not only is it a sturdy material, but also I think it has also this kind of aesthetic, side to it. And even when Cho Sehŭi was talking about concrete and sand, he was actually contrasting these two. By sand, he means those individual granules that cannot really stick together. And this is, of course, very well-known Korean sort of trope, right? We gotta stick together in solidarity to fight against, for example, foreign enemies and so on and so forth, right? So Cho Sehŭi was referring to that kind of a trope, and this kind of a sand doesn't work that way, but with concrete, actually it works. But the problem was that it was shoddily built, so it broke down. Even concrete broke down, right? And whose fault is it? It's not concrete's fault. It's not even sand's fault. And these materials that they dredged off from the Han River was actually, it turned out, I thought this was, the bad material they were getting, from the bottom of the riverbed. But it turned out that, what did I know? These were really good materials compared to like sea sand or pebbles from the sea or other places. Problem again here is the construction companies getting all these kinds of good materials at a very, very cheap rate and building these kinds of infrastructure that collapsed.